has been a speaker here before, as many of you know, most recently in December of 2021. It's my great pleasure to welcome him back with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very distinguished speaker, Commissioner Brendan Carr.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Rick, very much for that very kind introduction. It's always a privilege to be back here with you all. It's an intimate setting this year, which I love. It reminds me of a wedding reception. It's very fancy, so it's good to be here, but it's an intimate setting, so I got a couple of remarks that I'm going to get through, but also want to open it up a little bit to make it interactive and have you guys ask whatever questions you want. We're all amongst friends here, except for the video camera. But beyond that, it's good. I appreciate the introduction as well. You mentioned the 5G Crusader point. And my good friends in cable are always wondering why I don't have a branding that recognizes the great technologies they have. And I tell them that, look, DOCSIS 3.0 Crusader just didn't have the same ring to it as a 5G Crusader. But it's good to be here. Thanks again to Rick. Thanks to Chairman Wiley as well for the invitation. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but when I was sworn into the FCC in August of 2017, it was literally about an hour after I was sworn in that I got my first phone call from Chairman Wiley, and I thought he was going to congratulate me on getting sworn in. And no, he invited me to speak at the Media Institute. He has been a dogged advocate for this organization ever since. But I got to say, look, it's 2024. It's the summer of 2024, just about. My dance card is getting more full these days than ever before. It seems like every 4 years, people are interested in what Republicans on the FCC have to say. And then come the late fall, late winter, that interest goes away. So look, if it need be, I'll pencil in the summer of 2028 and come back and have another interesting conversation with you all. But it is an interesting, exciting time at the FCC. The very first time that I had the opportunity to speak here at the Media Institute was back in September of 2018. And what we were working on at that point was some fundamental reforms to America's infrastructure policies. And Chairman Pai had just tapped me to help lead some of the FCC's infrastructure reforms. And so I came here in my first remarks and walked through the steps we were taking on the infrastructure front to try to accelerate internet builds in this country. And we were at a point in time in which we were facing some real serious headwinds. From roughly 2016 through 2017, for instance, the construction of new cell sites in this country had effectively flatlined. So we needed to turn things around. And so what I focused on in those first remarks were both the infrastructure reforms that we were working on, but also the significant steps that we were taking on the spectrum front as well to free up more of the airwaves necessary to power 5G and a lot of next generation technologies. You know, one of the things I said in those remarks is that we were expecting to see an acceleration of internet infrastructure builds in the wake of those efforts. And thankfully, that's exactly what we saw. In those years after 2017 and 2018, we saw a significant increase in internet infrastructure builds in this country. We've seen mobile speeds increase something like 6-fold. We've seen millions of Americans be brought across the digital divide. We've seen a substantial increase in competition, including new forms of broadband technologies that didn't even exist back in 2017, including this new generation low Earth orbit satellites. So what we were working on in those years was a two-part playbook: infrastructure reform and freeing up spectrum. That's the winning playbook to ensure that we continue to see growth, expansion, competition in the broadband markets. And one thing that's concerning to me is that the last couple of years, I think, we've seen folks take their eye off the ball when it comes to just those two very key parts of the playbook. We're not seeing progress right now on spectrum, particularly at the FCC and across the administration, and we're not seeing a lot of work on infrastructure reform as well. We're seeing a lot of investment, in some ways this is a good thing, investment of federal dollars for broadband builds, but they're not coupling it with streamlining. And in my view, that's like stepping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. We're not making the progress that we need to. And so there are some storm clouds on the horizon. You look at BEAD, for instance, the administration's signature broadband initiative. There are a handful of states that are already raising their hands, despite the $40+ billion that have been allocated and saying that they're not going to have the resources necessary to fully end the digital divide. And that's a mistake, because the amount of money that we have appropriated over the last couple of years was enough to truly end the digital divide if we got the policies right. But there's been some misses there. There's been a excessive preference for fiber over other competing technologies. I believe that there should be fiber preferences in the appropriate circumstances. I've voted for it in different funding programs at the FCC. But the Infrastructure Act and the drafters of that provision were very clear that there shouldn't be a technology preference. And so I think one of the areas where BEAD has started to go awry is likely to see these preferences for fiber in places where we should allow other technologies, whether it's fixed wireless or this new generation of LEO satellites, to deliver and bridge the digital divide. But at its core, what we're seeing both in BEAD and in other places is a turn at the FCC towards the pursuit, and the administration more generally, of political objectives over the practical policies that are going to deliver wins for the American people. I think one of the most obvious examples of that is one that we'll be voting on in a couple of weeks at the FCC, which is a return to Title II style net neutrality rules. You can see it with a decision we made last year to go down the path of digital equity rules for the internet, which effectively handed the FCC sweeping new controls over every single feature of the internet ecosystem. And in many ways, it goes beyond the FCC's Title II provisions. It takes whole industries that have never been subject to the FCC's jurisdiction, including marketing, and puts it under the FCC's jurisdiction for the very first time. Again, I think it's sort of taking our eyes off the ball of that winning playbook. When it comes to Title II in particular, I'd be remiss if I didn't spend a few moments talking about that decision. At its core, if you read the FCC's draft order, in my view, there is no justification at all for Title II other than to advance the interest of expanding government control. And you can see for yourself, if you walk through the order, one of the things it says is that we need Title II regulation of the internet to ensure a free and open internet. But Americans know from their very own lives that that's not the case. You know, flashback to 2017 when the FCC repealed the two-year experiment with Title II regulation of the internet. I mean, you can remember all the banner headlines that were out there. CNN ran a banner headline describing it as the end of the internet as we know it. I like to tell a story about I had a high school ex-girlfriend who messaged me on Facebook and said that with this repeal of Title II, I was about to make the second biggest mistake of my life. I can assure you that neither one of them were mistakes. So people know from themselves that these sky is falling predictions simply isn't true. What happened when we repealed Title II? That's what I talked about at the beginning. Speeds went up, competition increased, and we had a network that was robust and resilient. So when COVID-19 hit, America's broadband networks withstood this massive surge in traffic. You know, we effectively took an entire year's worth of expected traffic growth and loaded it onto the network overnight when people started working from home and educating their kids from home. And our networks kept on humming. In fact, during COVID, our networks were 83% faster than those in Europe. And a big reason why, I would submit, is because Europe has long had the type of heavy-handed controls that the FCC wants to put in place on the internet through Title II. So this idea that to have a free and open internet, we have to have Title II isn't true. We've had one for the entire history of the public internet, including in the intervening years since the 2017 repeal. None of the Chicken Little predictions that were made came to pass. A second predicate for the FCC's new regulations is its assertion that there has been a complete, in its word, abdication of federal oversight over broadband since 2017. Now, a lot of you work in the broadband industry. I'd be interested if you feel like there has been a complete lack of federal oversight or regulation since then. And I submit to you that there has not, for really for two reasons. One, the Federal Trade Commission, the nation's leading consumer protection agency, continues to have jurisdiction over ISPs and applies the Federal Trade Commission Act, the FTC Act, in all of its consumer protection provisions to ISPs. Second, this is a big one that I think is effectively missing from the FCC's own decision, is the FCC's own rules. Again, just last year, we adopted these sweeping new rules that apply to the internet in the name of digital equity, including rules that apply expressly by their terms to throttling and other practices that the Title II order says. So the predicate for this entire Title II decision, which is that there was an abdication and an absence of federal regulatory oversight, is simply not true. A feature of that same type of argument is you'll hear the FCC's documents suggest or say that we need Title II so we can have consumer privacy protections. But here again, the FCC has it backwards. Right now, ISP's privacy practices are regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. A broadband consumer has the same privacy protections that a consumer of any other technology in this country has. But what the FCC would do when we classify the internet under Title II is we would strip the Federal Trade Commission of 100% of its authority over ISPs, and that includes exempting them from those FTC federal privacy rules. And it creates a donut hole that the FCC itself can't fill. And this is one thing that's different from the 2015-2016 FCC Title II decision, is that in 2017, Congress prohibited the FCC from applying our privacy rules to ISPs. So if a gap in privacy protections is what the FCC cares about, then maintaining the status quo is the answer, because Title II itself would create that gap. A similar argument that I've heard about is that we need Title II for national security. This is an interesting one to me because if it were true, I'd be very interested in it. But the FCC itself has identified no gap in national security that Title II is necessary to fill. In fact, we solicited comment on this very point in our NPRM and leaned in on it pretty heavily. But the record makes clear that Congress has already empowered agencies with national security expertise, from DHS to DOJ to Commerce to Treasury. They've empowered them with the authorities to address these issues in the communications sector. In fact, I thought this was interesting. The Biden administration submitted a specific filing in the FCC's Title II proceeding on the national security issues, but it confirms the very point that I'm making. It says the federal government already has, and quote, exercises substantial authorities with respect to the information and communications sectors. And the filing's bottom line is it tells the FCC to continue with the existing approach of deferring to those other federal national security agencies. Similarly, the FCC says that we need Title II to have this Section 214 authority to revoke what the decision says are any and all biased Section 214 authorizations that certain entities tied to China would have. We talk about China Mobile, China Telecom in the order. What's interesting there is two things. One, the federal government already has the authority to prohibit those entities from continuing to operate in this country. In fact, the Biden administration codified those authorities in federal law, 15 CFR Part 7, which they added and amended in 2021 and 2023. And those rules give them all the authority they need to stop those entities from acting. And they haven't. So either one of two things are taking place. Either one, the Biden administration doesn't believe that those entities are real threats, or they believe that they're threats and they've just decided to let them continue to persist in our networks. But either way, classifying the internet under Title II would not aid the federal government's case. In fact, those entities that I mentioned, they have filed at the FCC stating that they do not provide a service that would be classified as a Title II bias service. So even going down the path of Title II does not give the FCC direct authority over those entities. So again, instead, either the FCC should do what I called for about 2 years ago, which is to look at the entities we do have jurisdiction over and prohibit them from interconnecting with those entities, or the Biden administration itself should step in with their existing Part 15 authorities and take action. I could go on, but I'll sort of take a break at that point. There's other additional arguments, obviously, that the item walks through. One that I do want to mention, I think it segues into a different issue, is the FCC says that this is a decision that will allow it to promote free speech on the internet. It's interesting to me because at this very moment, this same government, the Biden administration, is in the Supreme Court defending what it views as its right to jawbone social media companies into censoring political speech. So the FCC's claim they're going to use Title II to defend free speech is something that I question at the end of the day. And this is something I want to talk about before I sort of transition back out, which is free speech. I think in this country we have been living through a surge in censorship that has accelerated over the last couple of years. I think some of it is tied to COVID, right? Anytime you have an increase in government control, you necessarily have a decrease in free speech, because free speech is the counterweight. Free speech is the check on government control. And I think a lot of this, at the end of the day, is cultural. In this country, we have to get back to embracing a diversity of opinions. And from my perspective, I think my friends on the progressive left have a lot of work to do to come back to this embrace of free speech. Because it wasn't that long ago that free speech was a core component of the progressive left's approach. I'm reminded, actually, the modern day op-ed launched, of all places, in 1970 on the pages of the New York Times. There was an editor at the Times by the name of John Oakes. And he said, in his words, prior to the 1970 launch of the op-ed page, that diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we start insisting that everybody think the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy. An editor of the New York Times, 1970, put op-eds in the Times precisely because they wanted opinions and perspectives that were divergent, in his words, from those of the New York Times editors. I think you flash forward to today, famous incident where Senator Cotton put an op-ed in the New York Times and ended up resulting in people being fired, effectively, for putting opinions in the op-ed section that were divergent from New York Times editors. The very reason we even have an op-ed page at all. So I do think as a country we need to return back to this embrace of diversity of opinions. Finally, I was asked to sort of say a little bit about what sort of, not just what I oppose, but what I'm in favor of. And I think fundamentally we have to get back to that winning playbook of spectrum and infrastructure. I mean, right now, when it comes to mid-band spectrum in particular, we rank America about 13th out of 15 leading markets. We're about 400 megahertz behind other countries, almost 700 megahertz roughly behind China in particular. So we've got to get back to that winning playbook of moving forward on spectrum. From 2017 to 2021, we freed up about 6,000 megahertz of licensed spectrum. And the Biden administration, in their spectrum plan, only identifies 2,800 megahertz to study, and 0 megahertz they've committed to actually freeing up. So 6,000 megahertz actually freed up versus only studying 2,800. We've got to find a way quickly to close that gap. I laid out a spectrum calendar that I think puts us back on track to move at the same pace and cadence we've done before. And on infrastructure, obviously there's more we can do there. We can take some of those small cell reforms that I talked about here in 2018 and look to extend those to even additional infrastructure, including some cable infrastructure, so that we can make sure that internet builds get going again. There's other steps we have to do as well. We need a better national coordinating strategy. You know, right now we have all of these different funding streams going out, but they're not moving in a coordinated way, and that just risks wasteful spending and overbuilding. So fundamentally, we have to get back to making progress on spectrum, on infrastructure. And the third piece of that I would add is national security. You know, we've done some good work at the FCC, including on Huawei and ZTE. And the way I think about it, though, is there's sort of 3 layers here. We've made progress at the device layer, which is Huawei and ZTE. We've made progress at the carrier level, dealing with China Mobile and China Telecom. But as a country, we have to make some progress on the application layer as well. Because if we don't, you can have entities that are aligned with the CCP, that are beholden to the CCP, in obtaining just as much, if not more, data at the application layer that China Mobile could and that Huawei could. And that's why I've been really pleased with the progress we've been making in a bipartisan way on TikTok in particular. The House passed bill would definitively resolve that threat, and it's now moved over to the House, where I'm hopeful and confident that we will see some progress there as well. So with that, I'll end my filibuster, but happy to take any questions on really any topic. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have some questions for Commissioner Carr. I know we have reporters here.
Don't be shy.
About that far corner there.
Hi. My question for you, Commissioner Carr. I was wondering, did you have an opinion about the potentiality of like an ACP extension? Obviously, like there's a large effort, I would say probably bipartisan effort to pass the ACP to prevent it from expiring, and obviously many families probably been losing coverage or having to pay more coverage. Do you like have actual position on that? Do you believe that it's necessary, like your colleague Anna Gomez says, or do you think that it's a necessary use of government funds?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, look, our hands and the FCC are tied on this one. ACP is an appropriated program rather than a USF program, and because it's appropriated, it includes additional authorities that are beyond what the FCC can do through the Universal Service Fund, and so this one is squarely in the hands of Congress. And to your point, there's been bipartisan support for this. There's been bills introduced, particularly on the Senate side, that have Republican and Democrat support. And so at this point, it's a matter up to Congress entirely to decide the path forward.
Any others?
Commissioner, what are your thoughts on the Spectrum Auction Authority that the FCC has been asking the Hill for? I'm wondering in the play between identifying spectrum and for other uses and the lack of auction authority, where do you see that going?
Look, actually it was March of 2021 when I gave a speech where I specifically said one of the top priorities for us has to be ensuring that Congress renews our auction authority. So I was disappointed both that it expired and that we didn't see a significant push ahead of time from the administration to make sure that didn't happen. At the end of the day, a lot of the pushback comes down to a question of national security, where DOD and others have their own interests and goals that they're looking to defend. And what I would simply say is this, that when America frees up spectrum, when we move forward on these issues, it advances our national security. Because when we free up spectrum, the rest of the world take notice. It helps us make sure that we have a seat at the table when we are negotiating standard-setting processes around the world. It helps dictate when capital flows to U.S. markets. It allows us to be the leader rather than China and others. If they have spectrum auction authority, which obviously they do, and if they can clear spectrum more than we do, the eyes of the world start shifting to them. And so I do think we need to sort of understand that spectrum leadership is part and parcel of our geopolitical leadership and continue to articulate that point. But obviously we need to get the spectrum auction authority back, and we have to keep moving. But in the interim, there's more that we could do. I think if the FCC itself were to do what I did and put out an actual spectrum calendar, here's the bands we would move on these timelines, I think they could help add some urgency to congressional action. Because if we're just saying, give us our authority and we may or may not do anything, it's not as a compelling argument as what the reality is, which is we need to get it back and we need to start moving on specific spectrum bands.
One last question, perhaps.
Commissioner, you talked about freeing up spectrum. Is there room for dynamic sharing in that whole equation?
It's possible. My starting point when it comes to spectrum is always to look where we can clear spectrum and make it available for high power exclusive use. I think those are the types of use cases that, as an original matter, are going to be able to be beneficial in terms of bringing people across the digital divide, but also be the types of licensed spectrum uses that's going to enable massive capital investment into these networks, which we have to do. So step one for me is always look where we can get exclusive use spectrum, but then we move on from there, including shared spectrum, unlicensed spectrum. Those are other options that we should do when we can't find it. But again, one of the most recent things that we did was free up about 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed. And so I think on balance, we really got to stay focused on licensed exclusive use as sort of our next thing up.
Commissioner Carr, thanks so much for being back.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.